The 2024 season hasn't even come to an end yet for the Saints, but there are three coaching candidates linked to their job opening. Are either any of them worth it for New Orleans? We're going to assess all the options and talk about some names that haven't been mentioned yet, all here on the Straight Up Saints podcast.
You're listening to the Straight Up Saints podcast.
What is up, Houdat Nation? Welcome back inside another edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast. I'm your host, Chris Rosvoglu, and as always, the Straight Up Saints podcast is brought to you by Scott Fickner Injury Lawyers. You've been injured in any kind of accident, car, truck, 18-wheeler, or hurt offshore, Scott Fickner handles it all. You give him a call at 504-500-1111 for a free consultation. They'll always fight for the win. With the Saints no longer having Dennis Allen as the head coach and Darren Rizzi as the interim coach, that puts them in a rare position of you got games to play, but you also got a coaching situation to figure out. And although the Saints have said that they're not going to get a head start on their coaching search, I think that is a bunch of BS. I think they're probably assessing candidates as we speak, and they should. You kind of have this, 2-month gap as opposed to everyone else where you get to take advantage. Now, it's not fully take advantage, right? Because you're at a disadvantage that you had to fire your head coach in the first place. But I think for New Orleans, they're in a really important spot where you got to figure out who's going to be this coach to usher in that next era of New Orleans Saints football, and hopefully one that's way more positive than what we've seen over the last 3-4 years. And while the Saints haven't zeroed in on any targets yet per se, and, there's no one who's favored for the job yet, we already got 3 names that were linked who aren't Darren Rizzi to the opening. And in consideration, and this comes from ESPN's Jeremy Fowler, the 3 names that he did mention, Aaron Glenn, Joe Brady, and Vance Joseph. And I think all 3 names are interesting for different reasons, and we'll go through them. But what I decided for this episode, because the Saints are playing the Giants this weekend, and I know there is a football game to be played, but we'll still have the halftime show. We'll still have our post-game live stream. That is not the type of game that you get amped up for. I'm sorry. It's just to be brutally honest with this situation. The Saints are a 4-8 football team that don't exactly have a lot of exciting playmakers at the moment, whether that's from injury or just not drafting well. Their defense isn't very exciting, and that's just where they're at. And yet, even though I just mentioned that the Saints are 4-8 and they're not that exciting of a football team and they don't have a lot of talent, the Giants are fucking worse. The Giants are an abysmal football team with 2 wins that just continues to find ways to lose while also looking like the biggest clown show you'll see in the NFL. So for me, I'm not super excited to talk about that game. I think the Saints will win. I think it might be one of those games where if the Saints win by double digits, they get Brian Daboll fired, and that might be their shining achievement of this year. And honestly, I hope that's what happens because it'd be freaking awesome. But outside of that, it's just not the game you want to analyze. So I want to focus on the coaching search for the Saints, and I want to break it into 3 categories. We're going to go through the familiar faces, who are, ironically enough, the 3 guys linked to the job right now, the known, and the unknown. So we're going to start off with the known and the unknown, and we're going to finish off with the familiar faces because I think the familiar faces one, there is, legitimacy to those 3 names for Jeremy Fowler to bring them up this early in the process. So let's start with the unknown. The first guy unknown that I think is probably the most intriguing, everyone's going to be Ben Johnson, the Detroit Lions offensive coordinator, who is one of, if not the best offensive play caller in the game right now. Now, you could say it's because of their weapons, right? David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Jameson Williams. Like, they have options and weapons for days, and I get that. But what he's able to do with them and make sure that they always establish the run game early and often, I think it's important. And he's just great. And he will have kind of his pick of the litter, right? I think that, for me, Ben Johnson makes a lot of sense for a team like Chicago. They got a lot of talent. They got their quarterback in Caleb Williams. They're looking for a guy that can be that next coach of the future. And maybe it's him. And maybe that's the type of job he's been waiting for because he didn't take one this past cycle, and he's going to probably take one this cycle. So Ben Johnson, top option, no doubt about it. From the unknown, he is the best and most intriguing option, but I don't think he's a realistic one. Why would Ben Johnson, who waited an entire cycle to pick a job, pick the Saints one with no quarterback of the future, with not a lot of money to spend, and a roster that isn't ready to win right now? That just, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. So I love the idea of Ben Johnson coaching the Saints, but if I'm going to be just real honest with myself and with you guys, I don't expect him to go there. So let's kind of wipe him off the board, but obviously we mention him because I'd be dumb not to. Liam Cohen, the Bucs offensive coordinator, he's going to get some talk. I don't know if he'll get enough talk, but what he's been able to do with Baker Mayfield this year is really impressive. What he's been able to do with their running back room. Bucky Irving's looked tremendous. They've really looked great at times. Now, They've been a little sporadic, and I think a lot of that's due to injuries. No Chris Godwin for the rest of the year. Mike Evans has been out of the lineup until recently, so that hurts. But a lot of guys are having career years right now. I mean, Cade Otton's been great for them at the tight end position, and Baker's been great. And I think for Liam Cohen, I just think you see quarterback success where he goes. At Kentucky, Will Levis played really well with him, and that's why he was an intriguing prospect. He leaves Kentucky, he goes to the Rams, and now you see him at the Bucs. He's having a really good stop right now there. So he's an intriguing coordinator. I don't know if we'll see that jump from one NFC South team to another, but I think if we're just talking about unknowns, Liam Cohen seems to have that juice for quarterbacks. And man, the Saints can use that. So he's an intriguing guy. The third one I'm going to mention, who's also an unknown, but man, he's getting the job done, is Jesse Minter, the defensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Chargers. He's got NFL experience, and he definitely has experience working with the Harbaughs. He's worked with both Jim and John's, worked with the Ravens, worked with the Chargers, and obviously had success at Michigan and all their talent that they had there in Ann Arbor. I think Jesse Minter would be a really intriguing name if you're going off the board in terms of going away from the offensive hires, going away from the known commodities. He's an intriguing one because the Chargers didn't make a lot of huge changes from a personnel standpoint on defense, and yet they have completely just revamped that unit production-wise. You are seeing guys have career years. You're seeing them play just better as a unit, and I think that comes down to coaching. So Jesse Minter, to me, if we're just going off the unknowns as a defensive coordinator, he is the most intriguing one to me. So those are the top three names that I would mention for the unknown category. The honorable mentions, who I don't think are that honorable, if I'm being quite honest, would be Todd Monken of the Ravens, who I think is a really good coordinator, but I don't think that's the guy that you think is going to bring the next brand of Saints football to you. That's not a guy I would trust. Kellen Moore, I think he's doing well with Philly, but Philly's got the personnel for days, man. Like, you got your quarterback in Jalen Hurts, you got Saquon Barkley, you got A.J. Brown, you got Devontae Smith, you got Dallas Goedert, you got a really good O-line. Like, they kind of have it all there in the city of brotherly love. So I don't love that to be the guy that fixes the Saints. And then Bobby Slowick, who, like, I'm going to be honest, I think Bobby Slowick is Pete Carmichael with good PR. Like, I do not think the Texans do anything interesting offensively, and yet people mention Bobby Slowick, but I just don't see it with him. I don't see it with his offense. I don't think there's a lot of creativity there. So if we're going to go three names for the unknown, I'm going to go with Ben Johnson, Liam Cohen, and Jesse Minter. Don't think Johnson is as realistic, so maybe Liam Cohen and Jesse Minter would be interesting for the Saints. So we're going to switch it over to the known names, and we're going to keep it going with the trend of threes here. But before I do that, I want to get a quick word from Theo's Pizza.
Scan the code now and tackle your hunger with Theo's Pizza, your neighborhood pizza with 5 convenient locations. Who dat? Your taste buds are about to find out.
Once again, thank you to Theo's Pizza. So let's keep it rolling here on the Straight Up Saints podcast. We just did the unknowns, and we really focused on 3 with an honorable mention. We're going to do the same here for known. 3 names, 1 unhonorable mention for this one. So let's start off with the first one, Bill Belichick. I don't want Bill Belichick coaching the New Orleans Saints. I still think Bill Belichick could be a really good NFL coach, and obviously his track record's so tremendous that he should get a second chance, and I think he will get a second chance. But I just don't think this is the spot for Bill Belichick. They have no defensive line. Their secondary you're trying to figure out. And for Bill, like, defense is his forte. Why would he go to a team where they don't have an offense and they don't got a defense? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I don't think this is a landing spot for him. And I also don't think the Saints, who one of their biggest problems has been drafting, should bring in a coach who is notoriously known for wanting personnel control and not wanting to give up said power. So I don't love the idea of Bill Belichick coaching the Saints. I don't think that Bill Belichick should be kind of like blackballed from the league. I think that you can say that he should be able to go somewhere else, maybe Jacksonville, and have success. But I don't think New Orleans is the spot. I just don't think it is the spot for me. The second name, and I think this is the one that intrigues me the most out of the known commodities, would be Mike Vrabel. I mean, he's a former coach of the year, not far removed, 2021, had a winning record with the Titans, took the Tennessee Titans to an AFC championship game. And the downfall of Mike Vrabel in Tennessee didn't really start until they made a move that he hated when they made it, and that was trading A.J. Brown. He didn't want them to trade A.J. Brown. He loved having him there. He was against the GM getting rid of him. They got rid of him regardless of what he said. And he ended up being right, which I think also kind of helps his argument in a sense. So, look, a coach that is going to establish toughness, you know that they're going to really predicate themselves off running the football and being a really good defensive team. I think Vrabel brings that different energy that the Saints have been lacking. Will give a lot of toughness to this squad. And if you're worried about the quarterback situation, I mean, the Titans made the AFC Championship game with Ryan Tannehill, and now Ryan Tannehill played really well for them, and I don't want to knock Ryan Tannehill, but, he's had success with Ryan Tannehill. Derek Carr is kind of in that same class, and I'm not saying Derek Carr should be like the motivation for them to get Vrabel because he's worked well with Tannehill. Absolutely not. But he is an intriguing one to me, and I think there's always a coach who kind of leaves, comes back after resetting, and figures it out. And I think Vrabel should be the no-brainer one here. I would kind of be surprised if he's not, especially after we've just seen a guy like Dan Quinn, had success with the Falcons. We thank him for blowing the 28-3 lead. And now Washington right back into the playoff picture after years of being an afterthought. So Vrabel, I think out of the knowns, is the most interesting, and he's the one that I would circle as a guy that I'd like to see coach the Saints, if I'm narrowing down a list. Now, the third one has to be Brian Flores. I think Brian Flores has done a really good job of rebuilding kind of his coaching value in Minnesota. That was not a good unit before he got there. And that is a unit now that, against some really good quarterbacks, has forced them into high turnover games. And I think for Brian Flores, there is no question about his defensive play calling skills. I think he's great in that. You've had quarterbacks just really rave about his scheme. I think the one question for Brian Flores, and it's a big one, and it's kind of a question that I think you could ask about Vrabel too. Can you develop a quarterback? I think that is going to be a question for a lot of coaches. But I think for Brian Flores, unfortunately, with what happened with Tua and the fact that Tua was kind of pretty much sidelined by him, is not the best of look. Now, that doesn't mean that's who Brian Flores is. That doesn't mean that Brian Flores shouldn't get a second chance. He should get a second chance. There's no doubt about it. For the Saints, though, where they don't have a quarterback of the future, it's a question to ask. And I think, by the way, it is a question to ask for almost every coach that is going to be linked to the Saints. Can you develop a quarterback? Because that's the business they're going to be in. So for Brian Flores, because of how ugly things were with Tua, I think he gets heightened a little bit. But he's a coach that you're going to have to mention. He had two back-to-back winning seasons with Miami before he was let go. And yeah, they didn't make the playoffs with him. They did the next year with Mike McDaniel. But Miami still feels like they're kind of caught in that trap of you're good, but you're not going anywhere. Kind of like the Atlanta Hawks with Joe Johnson back then. That's where I kind of feel like they're at. So Brian Flores, I would mention him in that known category. Don't know how high I'd have him on the radar for me, but I think you got to mention him. He's done a really good job. Now, the honorable mention, and I joked saying it's not honorable at all, would be John Gruden. I can't make it clearer than I already did. I don't want John Gruden near the Saints for the sake of I'm tired of the Saints adding former Raiders to this team. The Raiders are not the type of team that you want to rebuild an image of. They're just not. And John Gruden has said a lot of awful things. You can't ignore that. He also just hasn't been that good of a coach. He just hasn't. The year is not 2000 anymore. So I'm going to mention John Gruden because I'm sure he'll be mentioned and linked to the Saints at some point during this process. But I hope that ship has sailed. And if it ends up coming back to the shore, fuck all of us, because I don't think that'll be a good situation for the Saints. So those are the known, and that leaves us for the familiar faces for the Saints. Before I talk that, I want to get a quick word from Scott McNair.
And Jonathan Williams brings it all the way back from the 20-yard line.
What a terrific way to end the first half.
And tonight's game is brought to you by Scott Vicnair Injury Attorneys. They always fight for the win.
You mean attorney? It's one lawyer. Scott Vicnair?
No, there's two.
Brad Scott and David Vicnair.
Well, it's confusing.
That it is. They could have picked a better name.
Scott Vicnair, Injury Attorneys, we fight for the win.
Once again, thank you to Scott McNair for being part of the program. We greatly appreciate it. So we've gone through unknown and we've gone through known. Let's talk about the familiar faces because these are the ones that are being linked to the Saints right now per ESPN's Jeremy Fowler. Let's start off with the main one. Aaron Glenn worked with the Saints. Lord knows he's got history with New Orleans. And I think this is a name that us fans all expected to be mentioned to them for a plethora of reasons. I mean, look, we know what he did as their DB coach. I think a lot of guys had their best seasons under him, which is a testament to his coaching. We know he was there as a player briefly. So there is that history there. And I think the Saints like people who understand what their culture is about. And I think Aaron Glenn does that. But what I would say about Aaron Glenn this year that makes me very, very interested in potentially him being the next coach of the Saints is I want to know how a coach adapts to rough situations. And I think as good as the Lions have been this year, they have more good players on injured reserve defensively than they do on the active roster. they lose guys every single week. If it's not Aiden Hutchinson, it's Malcolm Rodriguez. If it's not Malcolm Rodriguez, it's Alex Anzalone. If it's not Alex Anzalone, it's Derek Barnes. If it's not Derek Barnes, it's DJ Reader. Like, they just lose guys every single week on defense. And yet, they're 10th in yards. They've made some timely stops this season, and they've been a really good unit. And I think that comes down to coaching. And what I love about Aaron Glenn is you don't hear anything about the defensive issues they've had from injuries. That's not an excuse to them. And us Saints fans just got out of the Dennis Allen era where if he could mention injuries, he was mentioning it. So I think for Aaron Glenn, he's done a really good job for Detroit, fighting through those injuries, still being a top 10 unit in yards. He knows the culture. The Saints had a lot of success, especially in the secondary with him. I think he's a name that you can't ignore. And for everyone who might be like, man, I don't want to go that defensive route again. It might not work. Aaron Glenn might not be the guy. Or who knows? Maybe he kind of has that like start to a career that D'Amico Ryans has had in Houston. Granted, Houston's been a little underwhelming this year. So I think you can't really use the past for guys like this who are going to be a first-year coach because every single coach is different. How they're able to get their message across the players in the locker room, how they're able to scheme week to week. You can't. It's apples to oranges. You can't make the comparison. And I think for Aaron Glenn, he deserves to be in the mix. I would be excited if he was the Saints head coach. I'm not saying that's my number one pick because honestly, I don't really have one at the moment. I want to gather more information before I feel like, man, that's the guy who I want to run the Saints. But the Saints were to come out and say, Aaron Glenn's our next head coach. You know what? How can you be mad about that? Yeah, I guess you could say you're not getting away from the Sean Payton era, but Aaron Glenn is doing things in Detroit that us fans want the Saints to do. We want them to play with that brand of toughness. We want them to be a high-flying defense. We want them to be able to get the Saints back to being respectable, which they haven't been in a couple years now. So Aaron Glenn, I think, is an interesting name, no doubt about it. The second one that I found very, very interesting, and I don't know if it's a good thing. I can't believe we've kind of gone down that route, is Vance Joseph, who's having a tremendous year as the defensive coordinator of the Broncos. That defense is playing lights out. I mean, they just had 2 pick sixes on Monday night against Jameis Winston and the Cleveland Browns. For me, though, I know he's got, his roots are in Louisiana, and there is that connection there. I think Vance Joseph hiring him would be very similar to a Dennis Allen situation where, like, I have history of you being a coach. And unfortunately, like, you weren't that successful. He was 11-21 as a head coach. Now, does that mean he can't get better? No, he could get better. But I think for the Saints, who you just fired is always important because you usually don't go back to that same thing. And I think if the Saints were to replace Dennis Allen with Vance Joseph, it'd be really similar. Dennis Allen stunk in Oakland. We all said that's who he was as a coach. The Saints tried to tell us he wasn't. And guess what? Surprise, he was still shitty as a head coach. And Vance Joseph wasn't a good head coach. He's having a really nice revival as a defensive coordinator. And if he gets another coaching job and ends up being yet again a bad head coach, it is what it is. He's just going to be one of those guys who's a great coordinator, not a good head coach. So I would be scared to go down that route again if I'm New Orleans. That's the second guy linked to them in familiar faces. And then 3, this one, I mean, I'm not surprised, Joe Brady. Joe Brady probably would be the most daring one of them to make out of these because I know there is familiarity. I know Sean Payton loved him back then, and maybe people want to get away from the Sean Payton stuff, but you can't ignore that quarterbacks play well with Joe Brady. I mean, LSU, Joe Burrow, that was phenomenal. Now, it's very clear that Joe Burrow is just great, and it doesn't all have to do with Joe Brady, but good quarterbacks have thrived under him. Josh Allen's having an MVP season with Joe Brady. Making him the OC midseason last year, getting rid of Dorsey, saved the Bills season. So I think he's done a really good job. I think Joe Brady's, a very intriguing candidate. Buffalo's averaging just a touch under 30 points per game this year. They're 11th in yards, despite the fact that they don't really have to get a ton of yards. They've been up in a lot of these games big time. So I think for Buffalo, it's interesting. You want to see how the next couple of weeks go for them. That's someone that you're going to watch in the playoffs too. So Joe Brady's going to be able to put a lot on film. But is he ready to make that jump? It all might feel a little too soon. And maybe I'm wrong, but I remember Joe Brady making that jump from assistant to passing game coordinator to offensive coordinator with Carolina, and it went down. And I know he's having that kind of step up now with Buffalo, and he's got the quarterback so he could thrive. Is he ready to be the head coach? It is a very important question to ask, and I'm not sure what the answer is. It'd be a risky hire. it would be a hell of an intriguing one. And I think at least there, you have an idea of who the quarterback or what his vision of a quarterback would be, because he knows what a great one is. He's worked with two of them in Burrow, well, three of them actually, Drew Brees, Burrow, and Josh Allen. Heavy emphasis, though, on Burrow and Allen, because those are the guys he had more of an influence on. Obviously, with Brees, so much of the mental makeup of the week-to-week is between Sean and Drew. So I think Joe Brady's an interesting one. But out of the three familiar guys, I think Aaron Glenn feels like the safest bet out of the three, and he's one that I'd be interested to see coaching the Saints. So there you have it. Went through our known, unknown, and familiar faces. The familiar faces all linked to the Saints right now, per Jeremy Fowler of ESPN. So we'll see what happens. Before I wrap it up, though, guys, I want you to let me know your thoughts on the Saints coaching search. Are there certain names that I didn't mention that you think they should look after? Are there a couple guys from this group that you believe should kind of get priority over the others? Let me know. And out of the 9 names that we focused on, which one's the most intriguing and promising to you? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for the Who Dat Nation.